Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video on Descartes and Akutagawa on uncertainty. I'm really excited for these next few weeks where we can talk about Descartes and we can talk about issues that figure more in a subdiscipline of philosophy known as epistemology, right? This comes from the ancient Greek word episteme, which means to know. So, epistemology is the branch of philosophy that is most especially concerned with questions about what we can know, how we can know it, how do we navigate situations of uncertainty, are there any certain truths, and what are they? Descartes is really foundational in many ways to this approach and this line of inquiry in philosophy. And Akutagawa does a really amazing job, in my view, of dramatizing the position of uncertainty. So we're actually going to start with Akutagawa and then move on to Descartes. But it's worth saying a little bit more about why it is that Descartes is so important in the history of philosophy. Descartes, it's regularly said, initiated modern philosophy. So, in other words, Descartes wrote the text that we're reading, the Meditations, in 1641. So, just timeline wise, this is right after Copernicus. This is right after Galileo. Descartes was, in a way, in the midst of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and himself played an enormous part in both of these endeavors. Descartes was the inventor of analytic geometry, so you might recall from high school, or maybe you're in a math class now, right? The Cartesian coordinate plane that you would use to translate, algebraic equations into geometry. He invented that. And he actually said that that was like a demonstration, like a concrete demonstration of his philosophical method, right? And so, Descartes was incredibly accomplished as a philosopher, as a natural scientist, as a mathematician, and his work is still very, very important to us today. So, for example, if you were to take more history classes, one of the main history classes that you would take would be history of modern philosophy. And almost certainly in a class like that, you would start with, or at least, Descartes would figure in that story in a really, really important way. And the Meditations really gives us like a concrete example as to why that's the case. So it's really, really important in the history of philosophy, and it's a really good thing for us to reflect on and consider as a class in the intro, right? So to begin with, let's talk about Akutagawa. Let's talk about the short story that I had you read in a bamboo grove, right? This short story is incredibly fascinating, right? There's really great movies, for example, that are based on this short story. It's really, really fascinating, gripping work, right? And how is it written? Well, it's written as a sort of sequence of testimonies concerning an event that took place that the police are trying to, in a way, reconstruct from the testimony, right? So the basic events that are described is that there's a victim, right? Victim wearing a pale blue robe, right? We learn at least one of the characters claims that this man's name was Takehiru, right? And the accounts suggest in some way or another Takehiru was with his wife Masago, and they were attacked in some way by this bandit named Tajimaru, right? And this is said to initiate the events that lead to Takehiru's death, right? But the thing is, the real difficulty and the real interest in this short story is that none of the accounts fully agree with one another, right? There's always some details that are different, right, between them. So, for example, Tajamaru provides a confession, right, his own testimony as to what happened. And part of what Tajamaru claims is that he killed Takahiro, namely in a sword fight, right? He like cut Takahiro from the ropes that he had him tied up in, and they went 23 bouts, right? Trying to engage in a sword fight, right? And so this is Tajamaru's, version of what happens, right? But Masago instead provides an account where she's the one who kills Takeharu. Tajamaru attacks them. Tajamaru has his way with Masago. And on Masago's account, Takehiru gave her this extremely contemptuous look, right? Like, you've dishonored me, you're supposed to be my wife, right? And you've been assaulted, raped, which, is said to be dishonorable in this culture, blah, 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 right? And consequently, Masago cannot live with, two men knowing her dishonor. And Tajamaru gets away and she kills Takehiru with a knife. Then finally, the last account that we get comes from a spirit medium who claims to be speaking from the perspective of Takehiru. And here, many of the details are the same. They were attacked by Tajamaru. Tajamaru had his way with Masago, and Tajamaru eventually runs away, right? But on Takehiru's account, as provided by the spirit medium, he claims that he killed himself, right? That he killed himself with Masago's dagger that she had, right? She also claims to have killed him with this dagger. So you can see we're already simplifying because we're only thinking really about three of the accounts that are given: Takehiru's, Masago's, and Tajamaru's. But we can notice that there are important details that are different in each one, right? Like, who killed Takehiru, right? Tajamaru claims that he killed Takehiru. Masago claims that she killed Takehiru, and Takehiru claims that he killed himself, right? So if you're the authorities, for example, you're the police officer that is taking all of this testimony and so on, right? You have to render a judgment, right? You have to figure out who killed Takehiru, right? And in that way, you can dispense justice by punishing them or whatever, right? But the point, really, of the short story is to make us really feel that uncertainty in the situation, right? You don't really have any basis for choosing one person's testimony over another's. You don't have your own objective eyewitness, point of view on the story. You only have the point of view of these people who are intensely interested in this event, right? Tajamaru wants to be a tough guy, right? Hence, he is the one who, claims to have killed Takehiru with his sword, right? Masago is interested in her own self-image, right? Maybe she's trying to protect Takehiru in some way. Maybe that's unlikely, right? So she has her own reason for recounting the story as she does. And then finally, Takehiru's testimony is entirely dubious, right? Because it comes through the perspective of a spirit medium who might have her own, desires, etc., relating to this case, right? And so what in A Bamboo Grove really forces us to reckon with is our inability from the evidence that we have to piece together what really happened. Therefore, I think that Akutagawa provides a really nice framework for us to think about uncertainty, right? A part of why the short story is kind of nerve-wracking is because it forces us as the reader to be in a position of uncertainty. Very often, novels are written from a third-person perspective, from a narrator who kind of knows everything, right? This short story explicitly denies you that, right? And that produces a certain kind of emotion as you're reading it, right? Anxiety, uncertainty, and so on. And so, this is what motivates philosophers to think about epistemic questions, right? Namely, that we're very often in a position of not knowing. This situation was really, really palpable for Descartes as he was writing, because you have the beginning of, you could say, like modern society, right? You have the beginning of the scientific revolution, you have the beginning of the Enlightenment, right? But these processes are very incomplete, right? um, at this point, there's a whole bunch of misinformation that is just sort of peddled out as knowledge, right? I mean, just as an example, religious authorities such as the church would always maintain that geocentrism is true and is the correct model for our universe. Why were they so attached to this model of the universe? Well, because they thought that the universe was created by God, and that God put human beings at the center of the universe, right? And if you just think about our perspective, right, when we look up at the night sky, it can appear, just because our perspective is here, right, that we're at the center of it somehow, that all of the planets are revolving around us. And so you can see in important ways that this kind of uncertainty, right, or this kind of false belief, then informs a whole bunch of other false beliefs, right? Well, if you think that you're at the center of the solar system, or maybe even the universe, and you think that everything revolves around you, well, you probably think it revolves in a circle, right? You don't have Kepler, you don't have this a notion of an ellipse. You don't have a, decentered vision of the universe that seeing orbits as ellipses requires, right? And so you're in this position where your one false belief, namely geocentrism, comes to infect, right, a whole bunch of your other beliefs. And so you're in this really troublesome situation where it's really hard to know what's true and what's false, and how do you come to know that, and so on. And just a brief aside, this is very much the situation that we're in, right? I mean, we hear all this stuff about fake news, for example, and we can very easily think about that as being a situation where we're like Descartes, right? We're maybe lost. We don't know what sources are really true, right, or certain. It seems like we just have all of these contrary perspectives, and we don't know how to, get a grip of things, to get an orientation in which we can start to really understand it. And so one, kind of story about Descartes that's really interesting is that Descartes thought about philosophy as being in the situation of being like lost in a forest, right? What you need in this situation, Descartes thinks, is a method, right? The worst case situation is, I've drawn all these little purplish, right, tracks, right? The worst thing that you can possibly do, the thing that would prevent you from ever escaping the forest, is to go in a circle, right? You're not making any progress. You are just kind of winding around and around the forest without ever making your way out, right? This is kind of a metaphor for when we're steeped in a bunch of false beliefs, right? We have this false belief about geocentrism that leads to a false belief about the orbits, that leads to these other false beliefs, right? And so on. And so you never really find a way to get out. And so Descartes' philosophy is really the insistence that we come up with a method, right? A method for getting out of this situation. And Descartes' advice when you're lost in a forest is to walk in a straight line, right? If you walk in a straight line, you will never run into the situation where you're just kind of lost, running around in circles and so on, right? You need some sort of orientation. You need a way that you can know to get out, right? Hence, Descartes' advice is to move in a straight line. So what does this mean philosophically? Well, this is Descartes' methodological doubt, namely that we should assume to be false anything that is even dubitable. So if you can raise any sort of doubt about it at all, Descartes says simply treat it as false and attempt to find something that can orient you with respect to this, right? For example, if in the Bamboo Grove we knew that one of the characters was telling the truth, then that could provide an orientation from which we assess and analyze the testimony of the other people involved. So this leads really to Descartes' first meditation. Descartes' meditation is really, really fascinating, interesting work. Descartes sort of envisions himself, thinking to himself on a chair by a fire, right? And he's trying to think about, well, what do I really know? Like, what is actually certain? What if I just went through the process of destroying everything that I could possibly destroy, such that I could eventually, on the other side of it, come out with something that I know for certain is genuinely true? So Descartes wants to bring to bear the most powerful skeptical arguments that he can, right? And to be a skeptical argument is to give reasons for doubting, right? So, for example, the first thing that Descartes notes is just that our sensory perception often gets things wrong. So for example, if you have a cup of water and you drop a pencil into it, right, the pencil will appear as if it is bent. You are welcome to conduct this experiment, on your own if you would like, right? It will look like the pen or the pencil or whatever is bent in the water, right? But you take the pen or pencil out of the glass of water, and in fact, it's not bent, right? What does this say? Well, it shows that sometimes our senses get things wrong. And I don't have any means of discriminating between those aspects that it gets right and those aspects that it gets wrong. And so for Descartes, because of his methodological doubt, this causes him to suspend all of the findings of his sensory perception, or even anything based on testimony, right? The next thing that Descartes points out is he says, okay, but there are some instances where you have a really, really vivid dream, right? You have a dream, and in that dream, you don't know that you're dreaming. It's a vivid dream and not like a lucid dream, right? And in these cases, right, what's going on is that you're mistaking something that's unreal, something that's in your head, something that you're really dreaming up, and treating it as if it were something genuinely real, right? And part of what Descartes has to say is that we don't have any reliable criterion for, differentiating between those cases where we can know that we're dreaming and cases where we know that we're not, right? Otherwise, we would never fall into vivid dreams, right? And hence, this provides at least some small degree of doubt on everything that we can discover in our physical world, right? And Descartes' final argument, his most powerful argument, is the evil genius argument. Now, Descartes knew that much of his audience was Christian, believed in the existence of God, for example. And Descartes said, okay, but what if God, or something like God, something with the power of God, were intent on deceiving me, right? They made it appear like, the world around me is how it is, but really, it's not. And this is going to date myself a lot, but those of you who know the movie The Matrix, right? The movie The Matrix is sort of based on this argument in Descartes. What happens in The Matrix is that everyone thinks that they're in the real world, everyone thinks that they're in the 90s or whatever, right? Just living their weird 90s life. And what happens is there comes this guy, Neo, right? And Neo realizes that the world around him is somehow not real, that it's kind of like a computer simulation, right? Made specifically to keep him, attached to this world, right? To keep him from realizing that it's fake. And so he wakes up, and when he wakes up, he's in a pod, right, that is essentially using him like a battery, right? So what's going on? Well, an entity much more powerful than him, right, namely, these people in charge of the Matrix, right? They are creating, in a way, a reality for him that is completely false, right? And Descartes, while he didn't have all of this in mind, certainly had in mind how Christianity, for example, propagated false beliefs like geocentrism and was seeking to really doubt everything that he could possibly doubt, right? Any conceivable doubt that he can acquire is enough, right, for him to discount that belief so that he can find out what's really true. Next week, we're going to discuss Descartes' second meditation, which is going to be on certainty, as well as Wittgenstein's reflections on certainty. And we're going to see that Descartes thinks that he can acquire beliefs that genuinely defeat these skeptical objections. And this becomes the foundation for his method and everything that he can know for certain to be true. I look forward to going through this with you next week.